Just before we get started with the episode today, have you ever landed in a new country, turns on your phone, and it's like, oh, roaming enables. Oh no, it's pulled my emails. Oh no, I'm getting a giant bill already. Why did I turn this off? Oh God. Well, not that genuinely happened to me. I got a mobile phone bill that was so bad that I just got a new SIM card and didn't pay it, allegedly. Saily, though, they're today's sponsor and they're going to fix it. Saily is an eSIM app that keeps you connected in over 190 countries without swapping SIM cards or paying surprise roaming fees. You install it once, you pick a plan in the app, and you're good to go anywhere. No queues at the airport, no dodgy SIM card street vendors, which feels like the most dystopian thing ever, and no juggling different SIMs for every border you cross. The plans are affordable, they're global or regional, and they even have built-in privacy tools. Block malicious ads, change your virtual location, save mobile data, works on iOS and Android, and if your device isn't eSIM compatible, they'll just refund you. Get an exclusive 15% discount on Saily data plans. Use the code SHADOWS at checkout. Download the Saily app or go to saily.com/shadows. And now back to today's episode. Britain isn't typically the country most people associate with fascism. I mean, after all, there was no British Hitler, no British Mussolini seizing power. Yet in the 1930s, there was one ambitious aristocrat who attempted to do just that, and his name was Sir Oswald Mosley, and he would become Britain's most notorious fascist. A charming and eloquent figure, Mosley initially rose to fame in traditional politics before abandoning democracy for the dark allure of fascism. He molded himself after Europe's dictators, preaching authoritarian rule, ultranationalism, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. By the eve of World War II, he'd earned the dubious title of Hitler's Man in Britain, becoming a symbol of homegrown extremism that the British people ultimately rejected. This is the story of Mosley's rise and fall, from privileged beginnings to fascist infamy, and how his fanatical movement met its end. Now, Oswald Mosley was born on the 16th of November 1896 into an aristocratic family in Mayfair. Fancy. As the eldest son of a baronet, he attended Winchester College and later the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. At Sandhurst, Mosley proved himself an excellent fencer and boxer. At the same time, he became known for his pride and his temper, as exemplified by the fact that he was expelled following a violent altercation stemming from a polo match defeat. Fancy. When World War I broke out, any past indiscretions were quickly overlooked for the then 18-year-old Mosley, as the British Army required every able-bodied man. He served using his skills first as a cavalry officer and later as a pilot on the Western Front, before being invalided out in 1916 due to injuries sustained in a crash. Although his military service might seem like a bit of a damp squib, it did secure him a reputation as a war hero. Coupled with a touch of aristocratic nepotism, this reputation helped him secure a position in the House of Commons in 1918. At that time, he became one of Britain's youngest members of Parliament, representing the constituency of Harrow as a Conservative, of course. There, he sat for a time being a good boy and doing what he was told by the men at the top, as backbenchers are wont to do. However, it wasn't long before he became disillusioned with the old guard that held the party reins. Consequently, he left the Conservatives and sat as an independent MP for a period before eventually joining Labour in March 1924. He didn't contest his seat the next time a vote came around, and so he left the Commons after the general election in October of that same year. By 1926, though, he was back, having won a by-election for the constituency of Smethwick. Once again, he proved to be an obedient little lapdog, doing whatever party leadership told him to do. Now, this stance served him well for a while, even earning him a junior ministerial role when Labour formed a government following the 1929 election. But by May 1930, he'd had enough of all that tosh, and he left the Labour Party to strike out with the man he respected and admired more than any other: himself. This saw him found the New Party in March 1931, and if nothing else, it was a peculiar blend of ideas combining left-leaning economic principles with very strong nationalist overtones. Thanks to Mosley's ego, a nascent cult of personality began to emerge, one that, in calls which were nothing if not prophetic, contemporary observers noted was reminiscent of incipient fascism. Mosley threw himself into campaigning, but the New Party failed to catch fire. He was even booted out of his seat following the October 1931 election. The electorate had seen what he was trying to sell, and they weren't buying. And this, right here, that could have been the end of the story. But then Mosley went on a little holiday. In early 1932, Mosley travelled to Rome to meet Mussolini, and he was really well received, to put it mildly, with the big-chinned Italian fascist staging a 100,000-strong black shirt parade to formally welcome him. And because there was no more expedient way to Mosley's heart than a bit of ego-stroking, it wasn't a major mental leap for him to take the new party's embryonic ideas, tweak them a bit and transform them into full-blown fascism. And so, Mosley returned from Rome a true believer. Now the stage was set for Britain's experiment with fascism, led by an ambitious aristocrat who had grown impatient with democracy. He began by dissolving the new party and in its stead founded the British Union of Fascists in October 1932. Now, much like Mussolini's followers, Mosley's recruits wore military-style uniforms and black shirts complete with armbands displaying a striking insignia, a flash of lightning inside a circle. They marched in formation and greeted their leader with stiff-armed salutes modeled on those of Italian and German fascists. Every one of these symbols was intended to convey strength, unity, and decisive action. Mosley wanted to present himself as a man of destiny, leading an army of loyal warriors, not merely another politician presiding over a committee. Now first, Mosley's British fascists attracted considerable attention and even some support from people who saw him as bold and modern. By early 1934, influential newspaper baron Viscount Rothermere, owner of the Daily Mail, had thrown his weight behind Mosley, with his paper printing the now infamous "Hurrah for the Black Shirts" headline in January of that year. Bolstered by such favourable press and Mosley's tireless campaigning, BUF membership surged to an estimated 50,000 by mid-1934. For a moment, it appeared that fascism might become a significant force in British politics. Mosley certainly acted the part of someone on the cusp of great power, as the BUF organised numerous rallies and marches across the country, touting itself as a dynamic alternative to Britain's tired establishment. Some of these rallies were enormous spectacles as well. In June 1934, for example, Mosley staged a mass meeting at Olympia Hall in London, drawing around 10,000 people to hear him speak under the banner of the Flash and Circle emblem. Similarly, in Manchester at Bellevue and in London's Hyde Park, throngs of black shirt supporters cheered Mosley's impassioned speeches. To his followers, Mosley was portrayed as Britain's strongman in waiting, a patriotic warrior capable of rescuing the nation from economic ruin and the threat of communism. He decried the ineffectiveness of Parliament's endless debates, promising that fascism would usher in decisive action. The BUF's propaganda echoed this sentiment by declaring that Britain needed leadership voluntarily accepted, empowered to do what people want done without delay. Mosley also maintained that his movement would restore to power the people in a way that modern democracy no longer could. In practical terms, this meant that Mosley expected to be elected through the normal electoral process, only to then use that mandate to suspend the usual checks and balances, his version of the standard fascist shtick. It's also worth noting that while Mosley cloaked himself in the Union Jack and preached British patriotism, his movement was deeply intertwined with fascist regimes abroad. Italy's Mussolini provided secret financial subsidies to the BUF, equivalent to about £2 million a year in today's money, and as Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, Mosley increasingly admired the Nazi leader. After all, the two men shared a very similar worldview. Consequently, Mosley benefited from both friendship and financial support. By 1936, Mosley's fascist credentials extended into his personal life. His first wife, Lady Cynthia, had died in 1933, and he had been in a relationship with one of the famous Mitford sisters, Diana, who, well, she loved herself a good bit of Hitler. The pair were married on the 6th of October 1936 at, believe it or not, the home of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels in Berlin. And it gets worse too, because guess who was the guest of honor at that ceremony? Yep, the man himself, Adolf Hitler. Alright, before we examine what came next for Mosley, let's pause and ask a crucial, often overlooked question. What did he truly believe? Now, certainly, he was a fascist. This much we have already established. But what was his particular flavor of fascism? Every nation and leader who flirted with the ideology inevitably added their own localized spin to it. At its core, Mosley's British Union of Fascists claimed to stand for a new order that would revitalize the nation, largely through an economic revolution. After all, it was the Great Depression, and economic considerations were the linchpin of nearly all political discourse at the time. Now, regarding the economic transformation that he envisioned, Mosley advocated for a corporate state, a concept that he borrowed from Mussolini directly. In this model, British industries would be reorganized into corporations representing both workers and owners, all under the supervision of the state.
Parliament, as traditionally elected, would be replaced by a technical parliament based on occupational voting, engineers voting for an engineer, farmers for a farmer, and so on. Mosley's logic was pretty simple. Career politicians were idiots perched atop ivory towers, disconnected from the realities on the ground and incapable of managing the economy effectively. So who better to steer it than the very cogs that made it operate? Class conflict, too, would supposedly come to an end as employers and trade unions would be woven into the fabric of the corporate state and work together under government direction. Mosley also promised that finance and industry would no longer conflict with the public good. Banks would be harnessed in the service of national production, end quote, and strikes or lockouts deemed harmful to the nation would not be tolerated. In his view, this was the path to abundance and modern efficiency, with Mosley describing the corporate state as, quote, the greatest constructive conception yet devised by the mind of man. Modest. It was a bold claim, to be sure, and even in his own time, many economists were skeptical. Still, Mosley sold it with fervor, arguing that under fascism, Britons would finally enjoy both strong government and social justice, with wages and prices being set fairly by state arbitration, rather than left to the dogfight of class war. Along a similar vein, he also called for massive public work schemes to slash unemployment, pass on useful skills, and give the UK some really good infrastructure in the process. So, to implement this grand vision, Mosley made it clear that normal parliamentary democracy was simply inadequate. He believed that the endless debates and shifting party coalitions of Westminster were just a recipe for paralysis. Instead, fascism, he argued, would sweep all of that away in favor of decisive action. Perfectly encapsulated by his repeated slogan, quote, the will of the people is greater than the right of the minority. In practice, Mosley meant that once a fascist government assumed power, it should not be hampered by opposition critics or second-guessing. With that in mind, he vowed to bring an end to the party game and dismantle the old party system entirely. Indeed, one of the more interesting aspects that emerges when you leaf through his extensive political bibliography is his candid admission that under his rule, democracy would become a relic of the past. He made it very clear the Parliament would relinquish its powers, honed over a century, to him. As he wrote himself, quoting again, in the first instance, fascism seeks power by the winning of a parliamentary majority. That majority will be used to confer upon government complete power of action by order. End quote. Not that he would abolish Parliament, of course. I mean, after all, what would be the point of the whole technical Parliament scheme then? You see, in his vision of Britain, Parliament would exist solely to accept or reject the party's choices. They would absolutely have a real right to veto, and they wouldn't be compelled to simply go along with whatever was presented to them. I mean, trust me, bro. To address the naysayers, Mosley already had an answer. The people's own dictatorship, as he openly called it, would still be perfectly democratic. If everything went, the government could be dismissed by the king or by a public referendum if it failed the nation, just as theoretically could be done to Mussolini's government in Italy. And I mean, how'd that work out for them? Now, to make his dictatorship more palatable, Mosley further stressed that it would operate under the impartial dispensation of Britain's historic institutions. Chief among these was naturally the Crown, which he always claimed to be a big fan of and which he respected immensely. From the start, the BUF was also rabidly anti-communist. Mosley regarded communism as a mortal threat to Britain, claiming that Marxists sought to destroy British traditions and prosperity. At BUF rallies, communist hecklers were frequently beaten and expelled by Mosley's black shirt stewards, while BUF propaganda warned of a Bolshevik revolution if decisive action was not taken. However, Mosley didn't stop at condemning communists. Over time, he increasingly fixated on another particular group, accusing them of being behind communism, the failures of capitalism, and virtually every other problem facing Britain. And you know exactly where we're going with this one, because of course it's fascism we're talking about. He had a problem with the Jews. Mosley's anti-Semitism began as a subtle undertone, but soon evolved into a central pillar of the movement. In the early 1930s, he occasionally echoed common anti-Jewish sentiments prevalent among elite circles. For example, he suggested that Jewish bankers in international finance, to use his own words, exerted too much influence and that Jewish communists were stirring up trouble. By 1934, however, Mosley, along with the BUF, had turned explicitly and aggressively anti-Jewish. This shift ignited what he described as a, quote, militant campaign of intimidation, harassment, and violence against Britain's Jewish population, particularly in London's East End, an area densely populated by tens of thousands of Jews. At the same time, Mosley's newspapers and speakers began circulating conspiracy theories that blamed Jews for everything from the inclusion of pornography in films to provoking Britain into war with Germany. As historian Nigel Copsey has noted, this represented a conspiratorial anti-Semitism that did not necessarily depict Jews as racially inferior, as one might expect from, say, the Nazis, but rather as a secret nation within the nation, subverting Britain from the inside. By targeting Britain's Jewish community in this way, Mosley was openly aligning himself even more with Hitler's Nazism. And this was very intentional, as evidenced by the fact that in 1936 he rebranded the BUF as the British Union of Fascists and National Socialists. Members even began referring to him as the British Führer, a moniker that he was only too happy to embrace. By the late 1930s, Mosley had fully revealed himself as an anti-Semite, authoritarian, and admirer of foreign tyrants. He had traded the give and take of democracy for the certainty of his own creed, a conviction encapsulated in the chilling motto he borrowed from Mussolini: all within the state, none outside the state, none against the state. And as we've already noted, this approach did not sit well with the British public. In fact, it was received like a cup of cold sick. So, how'd things go wrong for Mosley? It's worth beginning by noting that Mosley's political fortunes had always fluctuated, as best exemplified by the fact that back in June 1934, at the Olympia rally in London, the BUF's brutal tactics were laid bare. At that event, Mosley's stewards viciously beat anti-fascist protesters who dared to heckle him. Dozens of demonstrators were punched and kicked unconscious by black shirt squads at Olympia, and when the press reported on this orgy of violence, public opinion was left in shock. As a result, the BUF's membership collapsed, dwindling from roughly 50,000 at the start of 1934 to barely 5,000 a year later. This period also marked the withdrawal of Rothermere's support as he became humiliated by his association with fascist thuggery. They would bounce back from that, however, make no mistake, with a group that, while much more fringe than it had been previously, still wielded significant influence in British politics based solely on its membership numbers. By mid-1936, Mosley appeared to be back in full force. The self-styled leader of Britain's fascists once again commanded thousands of black shirts, and anti-fascist elements across Britain were beginning to grow increasingly concerned. Fortunately for many, 1936 also marked the turning point when everything started to unravel for Mosley as Britain emphatically turned its back on him. This shift was spurred on by an event on October the 4th in East London, the Battle of Cable Street. The battle began when Mosley, reveling in his notoriety, planned to march columns of uniformed black shirts down Cable Street, a street home to a large Jewish population, as well as a significant number of Irish residents. He knew exactly what he was doing. This was an open provocation, an act of intimidation aimed directly at the heart of the Jewish community. Unfortunately for Mosley, the people of London were not oblivious to his true intentions, and when he and 3,000 black shirts advanced toward Cable Street, they found the route blocked by at least 100,000 protesters. Among these demonstrators were Jewish and Irish locals, along with trade unionists, communists, and just ordinary Londoners who had caught wind of Mosley's plans and had decided that they weren't going to put up with that. Armed with barricades constructed from furniture and paving stones, the protesters united in chanting, "They shall not pass," a slogan originally used against Franco's fascists during the Spanish Civil War, and they readied themselves for the inevitable confrontation. However, the first strikes did not come from the black shirts, but rather from the Metropolitan Police. Determined in their view to uphold order, the police clashed with the protesters as they attempted to clear the road for Mosley's followers. As one might expect, the encounter quickly deteriorated. Soon, sticks, rocks, and even contents of chamber pots were hurled through the air in response, and a full-scale mass brawl erupted. Amid the chaos, numerous injuries occurred, but the crowd refused to yield. Ultimately, the police, fearing a full-scale riot, ordered Mosley to abandon the march in order to prevent further bloodshed. With their path blocked by popular resistance, the fascists had no choice but to turn back. The people of East London rightly cheered in triumph. They had quite literally stopped Mosley in his tracks. And it proved to be a humiliating defeat for him too, demonstrating that no matter how much clamour he might create or how many waifs and strays he might cram into turtlenecks, the decent ordinary folk of the island would not be swallowing this bitter medicine without a fight. And really, that was the last hurrah for British fascism. With a solid right hook delivered firmly to its face, it soon took multiple jabs from all angles, knocking it out completely. Weirdly, however, the one that historians often cite as being the most impactful of these success punches was the Public Order Act of 1936, which, among other provisions, simply banned the wearing of political uniforms. Doesn't sound like a big deal, does it? But it really was, and it completely destroyed Mosley's ability to present the BUF as a regimented, disciplined, pseudo-military force. For the type of image he was trying to portray, that was a devastating hit. Suddenly they were figuratively naked, and in their birthday suits, they could be seen as naught but a bunch of anti-Semitic yobbos. Later, Mosley would rebrand himself as an anti-war man, which in fairness did see his membership peak once again, reaching around 20,000 or so just before World War II. However, by then it was a very different BUF from the one that had existed only a few years earlier. It was a protest party, and little else. But in a turn that would likely surprise absolutely nobody, it was the declaration of war on the 3rd of September that delivered the final blow to the BUF and Mosley's relevance along with it. With Britain now at war with his best mate, his party was just outright banned in May 1940, and Mosley himself was arrested almost simultaneously, deemed a subversive element that simply couldn't be tolerated in such trying times. By the time he was released in late 1943 due to ill health, he found a Britain united, ironically, just as he had desired, but united against everything he stood for. News of his release during wartime understandably provoked public outrage and protests, a reflection of the deep hatred that he had earned as a fascist in the land of the Blitz. For the remainder of the war, Mosley was kept under house arrest in the countryside, far from the spotlight, his name having become a curse word on the lips of the very people he had claimed to save. So despite his well-earned status as a political pariah, by 1948, Mosley, ever quixotic and optimistic, attempted a comeback. This time, however, it wasn't with the BUF, which was clearly long dead, but with a new party called the Union Movement. The party advocated a form of pan-European nationalism that envisioned merging those parts of Western Europe not under communist control into a single entity, a concept he described as Europe a nation. Nevertheless, the British public had no appetite for either Mosley or his ideas. If he had been regarded as a pariah during the war, by 1948, with details about the Holocaust now widely available and well disseminated, the level of public hatred directed at him had reached previously unimaginable heights. Britons from all walks of life had seen the pictures from liberated camps, read survivor accounts, and naturally extrapolated what might have happened to their nations if, say, 300,000 Jews had seen a tad weaker resistance, and Mosley himself had been just a tad stronger. And with his re-entry into politics having been a disaster, he spent his autumn years unsuccessfully attempting to rewrite his legacy before finally dying in 1980. The revisionist efforts absolutely failed, and he remained as despised as ever. And still does. Thanks for watching.